Welcome back, everyone, to our study of Genesis. It's just a great joy and delight to be with you in this study. Today, we're going to be exploring Genesis 3 through 5. As I mentioned before, we're going to hit more chapters each time we're gathered together. And in so doing, we're kind of ramping up as we move our way through this particular book and all the gifts that it's going to bring us. So let's, as always, begin with a word of prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Father, we thank you, we praise you, we give you glory for the gift of this day, for the gift of your word. Open our hearts and minds to these origins of so much of our human existence. Help us as we study them, that we will find wisdom for our own spiritual journey, for our own brokenness, and how you wish to heal us of the effects, the way original sin has bent and broken us in particular ways, and how we can submit that to the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. We thank you again for your word and for our faith and for one another. In the name of Jesus, amen. So we mentioned before that Genesis is a book about beginnings, and we explored the beginning of the cosmos last week, the origin or the beginning of biological life, the human person. We saw the language around marriage in the end of chapter 2, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, what I grew up calling the leaving and cleaving passage, that you must leave your parents and cleave to your spouse. So we had a perfect cosmos, a perfect couple in a perfect garden home, all the fruits and plants they could desire to eat. All the animals were in union with them and not to be feared. God himself is visiting them in the garden. What could go wrong? Well, what could go wrong indeed? It doesn't take long before we recognize that the honeymoon is over. And we're now shifting in chapter 3 to the next major event in the primeval period. Remember, the primeval period, when we looked at the big picture of Genesis, is chapters 1 through 11. There's 4 important events in the primeval period: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel / Table of Nations that closes out the primeval period. So we're at event number 2, the fall of our first parents. So this is all part of God's grand theodrama, and we're now in Act 2 of the drama. The author already set the stage for us in chapter 2. It's all but one of the 4 major characters in this story, and the tree at the center of the fall of our first parents. And you remember last week I mentioned the text from the Catechism that is going to be our guide when we're looking at stories like we see in Genesis chapter 3. The wisdom of the Catechism, remember, said that the account of the fall in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but affirms a primeval event, a real event, a deed that took place at the beginning of the history of man. And Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault freely committed by our first parents. So it affirms the fall was a real event, but it also accepts that symbolic language is used to help us explore more deeply what happened. And I gave the example of if I worked out in the yard all day, I might come in and say to you, wow, I really worked my fingers to the bone. Now, I didn't in reality, but I am affirming a real event, that I actually worked all day and I worked really hard. Why did I use the figurative language? Because it dramatically gets the point across. It causes an emotional reaction. So this is a very, very important guide as we are studying Genesis chapter 3. Now, you remember we said that the tree was already introduced back in chapter 2, verse 9, that God planted in the midst of the garden the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God then says later on in verse 16, you can eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die. Now, in almost every ancient culture, trees have been symbols of ancient wisdom and life. So we shouldn't be surprised that our author here is going to use the powerful figurative language that would have been common in his day. And once we get what this tree represents, It really helps us enter the meaning of the story. If we get it wrong, then we miss the whole meaning of the story. So this tree of knowledge of good and evil, is where we want to put our focus for a moment. Sometimes we mistakenly assume that at this time, Adam and Eve had no capacity to understand the categories of good and evil because they don't possess that knowledge yet. And that's what the tree represents. They don't know good and bad. They don't know right from wrong. But the scriptures themselves prove otherwise. God has already set up moral categories for them. Here's what is good. Eat all of the trees in the garden that you like, for example. Here's what is forbidden for you to eat. So to take of the tree of knowledge of good and evil would be morally wrong and unacceptable. It's clear that they understood that command and the distinctions, and we'll see that in the conversation with the serpent and with one another. God told us not to eat it. We understood that, but they chose to do it anyway. Well, if that's the case, what does it mean, this tree of knowledge of good and evil? It means the term there, knowledge, is associated with possession and intimacy. It means by taking of the tree that you're now possessing knowledge of good and evil. That is to say that I, not God, am the final arbiter of what is good and evil. When I partake of that, I determine what is right and wrong apart from God. The Greeks had a name for this. It was called hubris. It was overreaching, self-exaltation, appropriating to ourselves what is uniquely gifted to God or to divinity. That's original sin. It's rejecting God's offer of life and love, the universe that He made for us, with its moral framework, and saying instead, I am in charge. I am going to possess good and evil. I'm going to be the arbiter of it. And no one can tell me what is right and wrong. Now, have you ever heard that before? That mood, that sentiment? You're not going to tell me what's right and wrong? That sentiment is at the heart of every sin we commit. I'm rejecting the boundaries that God has set, and I'm going to take what I want on my terms and look at the tragic consequences in our world from that. So that's what the tree represents. It's God's divine prerogative to create the moral universe, to determine good and evil, and reveal that to us. And by taking it, we're rejecting that God is the one that possesses that power, and we're trying to apprehend it for ourselves. Now, if I've expressed that inelegantly, I want you now to hear from Bishop Robert Barron in this 2-minute clip, because I think he does a really good job of walking us through the meaning of the tree of knowledge of good and evil and what it means for us as human persons.
God takes His first human beings and He places them, it says, in a garden full of delightful things to see and taste and experience. He gives them practically free rein. Eat of all the trees in the garden save one, and I'll get to that. But first look at the extraordinary permission. God wants His human creatures to flourish in this garden. There's nothing of the ancient mythological idea of the gods and human beings in a rivalrous relationship. The true God, who makes everything from nothing, can't be threatened by His creation. He needs nothing from it, demands nothing from it for His own, well-being. And therefore, God's delight is that we be fully alive. We're in a garden, not in a desert. More to it, the church fathers saw this. All the trees, and we're given liberty to eat of all these trees, represent all that makes life wonderful. Philosophy and art and science, stimulating conversation, friendship, politics, sexuality, everything that makes life wonderful is represented in the trees of the garden. And God says, eat of them all. Eat of them all. This is not a God who's trying to limit the human project, but rather the one who says, your being alive fully is my glory. That's the biblical God. Okay. So how about the prohibition? We do hear that they are prohibited from eating from one tree, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What does that mean? Well, God is the unconditioned good. Therefore, God is in his own being the criterion of good and evil. God is the measure of good and evil in his own being. Therefore, this prerogative belongs to God alone, to know good and evil. What's the original sin, the original problem? Is arrogating to ourselves the prerogative of determining good and evil. When our wills become the criterion and the measure rather than God. That, I would submit to you, it's a very subtle point. It's not really so much a particular offense. It's not as though, murder is the original sin, or thievery, or adultery. It's something more subtle and more fundamental than any of the particular sins. It's the move of arrogating to ourselves the prerogative of determining good and evil. That's the original calamity from which human misery has followed as surely as night follows the day.
So with that in mind, let's jump into chapter 3 and that opening sentence or verse. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other wild creature that the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman, ... That's ominous. A serpent scares us. Remember, figurative language evokes particular emotions. If there was just a random guy standing there, we might ask who he is, but we're not going to be immediately fearful. There's not going to be a knee-jerk reaction. That's the power of figurative language. A serpent awakens, for most of us, fear, dread, malice. It's danger, Will Robinson. And in ancient cultures, the serpent was also a symbol of hidden, dark, secret wisdom or knowledge. So it's a way that the author is trying to evoke those emotions or trepidations by employing this kind of mythopoetic image. Now, you're free to believe, if you choose, that an actual serpent spoke here. Logically, I suppose the devil could assume the form of a serpent, or he could possess the serpent, similar to the demons being put into the pigs in the New Testament. But what we can say for sure is that this is a fallen angel. It's what the last book of the Bible calls, or it's who the last book of the Bible calls, that great dragon that was cast out, the ancient serpent called the devil. So don't think about this, even though I have the image up there, it's just a snake like we imagine. The word there actually in Hebrew can be translated, and is translated in other places, as something like a monster or a great dragon. So this was something frightening, something that should elicit fear and trepidation. This isn't going well. So we don't get, of course, the full backstory of who this person is that's talking to Eve. We now, of course, have the advantage of the whole picture. We know the story of Lucifer, but let's quickly review that. Because the Catechism affirms, and our Christian faith affirms, and even Judaism affirms, that this is a figure opposed to the plans and purposes of God. I was looking up a few texts today. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4, for example, says, and that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into Hades and commanded them to pits of nether gloom. So let's explore a little bit about this person's background. Most of us have heard of the fall of the angels, and this ancient serpent that we call the devil just means someone who's breaking things apart. It comes from Greek diabolos, to scatter and shatter. That this figure is traced back to even before the Garden of Eden. And it's mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. It's mentioned in Wisdom chapter 2, verse 24, that it was by envy that this creature and other fallen angels with him rebelled against God and were cast to the world. Now, Isaiah actually gives us a poetic description of this person. In Isaiah 14, beginning in verse 12, it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn." That's where we get the term Lucifer, the one who bears the sun, or is a son of the dawn. You've been cast down to the earth. That's what 2 Peter 2 talks about. You who once laid low the nations, you said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. That's the other angels. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But it goes on to say that he was brought down to the realms of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Now, does that language, I will ascend to the throne of God, sound familiar? That's original sin. This in a sense is the original sin. It's the same sentiment. I reject God as being in control, and I'm going to be God. That's the great lie. By the way, a couple other places to look for this origin of Lucifer, the great deceiver here. You can look in Ezekiel 28, same kind of poetic language. Of course, he's mentioned, as I said at the top, in Revelation chapter 12, that ancient dragon that is the devil, chapter 12, verse 9. So we have the advantage of knowing this is not a good person that is talking to Eve. And then look at his strategy. Did God really say that you shall not eat of this fruit or eat of any tree in the garden? So what's his strategy? Number one, he wants to put God's goodness and trustworthiness into question. Did God really say that? What he's doing is he's planting the idea in Eve and really in the human family that God is capricious in his nature, that he is withholding. Number two, he plants doubt in Eve's mind, and this is really, really important. He plants doubt in Eve's mind about her own ability to really understand and know God's will for her. The devil still does this today. He wants to cause us to doubt that we can really understand what God's will is for us. And then he distorts God's word, right? It's incomplete. He isn't telling the whole story. So there's a particular strategy there. And of course, Eve is going to respond that God did not, let's see, what's the language? God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Now, what does Eve do? She isn't reducing what God said. She's actually adding to it. God didn't say anything about touching the tree, but she's added that. And that's also the tendency of the human person, to add extra rules to God's command. It's what Jesus is always accusing the Pharisees of. But remember, this is the liar, what the scripture calls the murderer from the beginning. What is he saying? God is withholding something good from you. You should take it. And if you take it, your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God. Forget that you're created in his image and likeness. This is about equality. This is about revolution. It's the same as the fall of the angels. So the devil's also always going to use half-truths. What he says is partly true. You shall not die, he tells Eve. Well, they don't physically die immediately, but they will die because now death has been brought into creation. Their eyes are going to be open, but with that opening of the eyes comes shame and fear, we'll see. So their choice has opened up the possibility of constructing a world where they are God, that they are the arbiters of moral right and wrong. And this is really tragic because remember, our first parents are constituted in a state of holiness. Man, it says in the Catechism, was destined, man and woman, to be fully divinized by God in glory. They'd been created in his likeness, but seduced by the devil, they wanted to be like God, but without God. And we'll see this theme repeated again and again and again in the scriptures. They bought his lie. They bought his half-truths. Why? Because they made room in their heart for that seed of doubt. They weren't ignorant. They weren't so innocent that they couldn't understand what was going on here. They made room for the seed of doubt that God may not be a loving father, the possibility that God doesn't have my best interest in mind, that God is withholding something good from me. They miss that idea that goodness goes hand in hand with boundaries. Think back to creation. It was all pronounced good, but God still created clear boundaries for each of the elements of creation. Birds in the air, animals on the earth, separating sea and land, for example. Every species produced only within boundaries after its own kind. Every parent knows that boundaries are signs of our love. You don't put a fence around a swimming pool because you want to be a killjoy. You create that boundary as a symbol of your love, affection, and care for your children. Yet, whenever God sets a boundary, we tend to see them as restrictive, as arbitrary. God is withholding something for us. He's just this cosmic killjoy or cop who's not wanting us to have any fun. But in truth, God is a loving Father who gives us boundaries as symbols of His love. He wants to give us direction. Remember, that's the meaning of Torah. It's to point the way, how to live fully joyful human lives. Now, this only wasn't the first fall. It won't be the last, because we live out this scene every time we sin. This pattern of half-truths, of sowing the seed of doubt that God may not have our best interests in mind, and deciding that, in fact, I want to be God, I want to be the one who determines good and evil, that gets repeated over and over and over again every time we sin. 1 John 2:16 talks about this, right? That the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, that comes not from the Father, but from the world. So listen to paragraph 397. Humanity, tempted by the devil, lets his trust in his Creator die in his heart. That's precisely what we said. And abusing his freedom, he disobeys God's command. This is what man's first sin consists of, and all subsequent sin will be disobedience toward God and lack of trust in His goodness. It's a repetition. History truly repeats itself. And again, what does 1 John 2:16 say? Everything in the world, and by world he means the worldview that's opposed to the plans and purposes of God, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from this way of thinking about a world without God. And look at those three elements: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life. It's matched to the very language that we see in the original sin. Lust of the flesh. She looked at this fruit and said, what? It's good to eat. That's what we call our appetites. The lust of the eyes. What does she say of that fruit? It's a delight to look upon. It's a delight to the eyes. And the pride of life. What was the promise? This fruit is going to make me wise, apart from God. So that's called triple concupiscence. It's that way that sin works its way into our life. And the sad reality is that freedom, the freedom that God gave the human person, allows for the most horrible crimes in our world. And at the same time, the most beautiful and selfless acts. Deacon Scott talked about this in his Sunday homily, focusing on what's good and true and beautiful in our world instead of continually pulling up these nets of stinking fish of everything that's going wrong in the world. What does the scripture say? You are called for freedom, brothers and sisters, Paul says in Galatians 5, but don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but to do what? To serve one another through love. That's Galatians 5:13. So this is a really revealing verse about human nature, the human condition, and our struggle for sin. We should see this scene repeated or echoed in our own lives. When we look at any sin we commit, if we're really truthful, if we really look at our intentions, the root of that action is in some way believing that God is withholding something good from me, and by God, I'm going to take it. I'm not going to respect the boundaries that God has created. So God is withholding from me, and every sin is in a sense saying, by extension, I'm God. I'm going to be God. I'm going to say and determine in my life what is right and wrong. Think about sex. Now, don't think about it long, because you're Catholic and you'll have to run to confession. Maybe you're too have too much scrupulosity. But think about sex for a moment. There's a human good, a gift from God, and yet around it, God creates boundaries. I want you to enjoy the gift within these particular boundaries and look at all the sadness, tragedy, human brokenness, family brokenness that results when we take that good and we don't use it within the boundaries that God put around it. It creates tragedy. We see this scene repeated, really, as I mentioned, all over, not only in our personal life, but throughout the scriptures. One quick example, and there's many of these, but let me give you one. The language in Genesis says that Eve saw that the fruit was good, or it's pleasant to the eye. It's the Hebrew word tov, T-O-V. It's good. You can translate it ripe or beautiful, even. It's used for human persons. There's a moment where David does not go to battle when he should. He's left home alone. He's reclining on a couch. He gets bored. He picks up the equivalent of remote control on this couch he's reclining on. So he's the first couch potato. And he starts clicking through that ancient remote control, which is really him looking across the rooftops of the city of Jerusalem below his palace. And eventually he clicks to channel Bathsheba, or what I call sometimes Cinemax, S-I-N. And he sees her bathing naked on her rooftop. And it says in the original Hebrew, he saw that she was tov. He saw that she was good. She was pleasing to his eye. It's the same language of Genesis chapter 3. And so what did he do? He didn't respect the boundary that Bathsheba belongs to another. And it says he grasped her. He took her. The same language of Eve taking the fruit. He didn't respect the boundary. He took a good, but on his own terms. He said, I'm going to become God. In spite of the commandments of God, I'm going to determine what's right and wrong for me. And look at the tragedy that happens in the life of David, because he saw a good, but he decided to take it on his own terms. We also see this language of the first fall in the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. It seems very clear, especially in Luke, that Luke wants us to see this connection. The triple temptation is matched to that triple concupiscence that we talked about: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, pride of life. And that all connects back to the first Adam. Remember, Jesus is presented by Paul and later by the first Christians as the new Adam. He's inaugurating a new creation. And so look at the triple temptation. If you're the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. What is that? It's lust of the flesh. It's appealing to his appetite. I will give you all authority and power. And he shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth. Jesus sees with his eyes everything he could possess if he gives into this temptation. That's lust of the eyes. Or thirdly, throw yourself down from the temple. That's the pride of life. To tempt the Lord, to show that you're so powerful that you can even command the angels to bear you up. You can defy gravity. That's pride. That is hubris. So the devil has been following this strategy from the very beginning, and he lives that out in our own life. Again, look at the sins you repeat, and you can trace them back to these three principles: lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, pride of life. Here's one other place that you see this, that many of the early church fathers say that everything we saw at the Annunciation of Mary was a repetition of Genesis chapter 3. Remember, it's the inauguration of a new creation. So we have an angel, not a fallen angel like Genesis 3, but a holy angel. We have fruit here, but what is it? It's the fruit of her womb. And what is also in her womb, or who? The new Adam. And if we've got an angel and we've got fruit and we've got a new Adam, who are we lacking? We're lacking the new Eve. And that is why early Christianity, very early on, refers to Mary as the new Eve. Remember, Eve means the mother of all the living. And Jesus on the cross entrusts Mary as mother to John, what the earliest Christians saw as a universal bequest to the church. She becomes the mother of all those living in Christ. She becomes mother to all of us. And we, her children. Of course, when she's depicted in Revelation chapter 12, it speaks about how the serpent is trying to take her offspring, that is the Christ, the Messiah, and her other offspring. He's trying to destroy her other offspring. That's all of us. That is the church. So that scenario is repeated in the Annunciation. And I mentioned how early it is. Irenaeus, born 130, very, very early in Christianity, said that the knot of Eve's disobedience was loosed by the obedience of Mary. For what the virgin Eve had bound fast through unbelief, this did the Virgin Mary set free through faith. So the first Eve was also a virgin. The first Eve was also conceived in a mysterious and miraculous way, so much more so the Virgin Mary, who unties the knot of Eve through her obedience. I love this image. I don't know if I've showed it before in the parish, but there's the first Eve and the new Eve. And look how the first Eve is holding the fruit of her disobedience, but Mary is graciously guiding her hand to the fruit of her womb, the source of redemption for all of humanity. Look down at their feet, how that ancient serpent is coiled around the leg of the first Eve, but its head is crushed under the foot of the new Eve. So it's very, very powerful, evocative imagery that we'll see later. That idea of crushing the head of the serpent happens through both the seed and the mysterious woman that's mentioned in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Now, what happens immediately after Eve and then Adam take the fruit? They become afraid. Suddenly they knew, so now they do have knowledge that they were naked. So what do? They sew fig leaves together. It's this wholly inadequate attempt to cover ourselves. We do this all the time in many ways. So Scripture here portrays the tragic consequences of this first disobedience. Adam and Eve immediately lose the grace of original holiness. They become afraid of the God of whom they have conceived now a distorted image, a God that is jealous of his prerogatives, that was capricious and withholding, and because they took it, he's going to destroy them. They now fear him. And we said before that this also brings shame into the world. That idea from Genesis 2:25, they were naked without shame. In St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, this is very, very important because nakedness was symbolic of an absence of barriers. Nakedness symbolized total trust, transparency with others. There was no objectivization of the other. There was no judgment. There was no comparison. It reminds us that we were made for a sincere and total gift of self to one another. Our body, including our genitals, as uncomfortable as that makes us, are revelations that we are made to be gift. And so that's why this nakedness was so important. St. Augustine says, that the deepest desire of the human heart is to see another and to be seen by that other. But because of original sin, we now have the beginning, the bereshit of shame, of alienation, of covering the gift. Their eyes were open, to be sure, in the half-truth of the serpent, but it's not a real illumination. They're really seeing one another differently now. And of course, when they're confronted by God, we have the devil made me do it. Flip Wilson didn't come up with that idea. Passing the buck was there from the primeval period on. Not taking responsibility for our own actions. What does the woman say? The devil made me do it. What does Adam say? Well, the woman that you gave me. So Adam's even kind of trying to blame God. You gave this woman to me and she gave me the fruit. But then there are consequences, right? So this whole scene is like a scene from Seinfeld, right? Passing the primeval buck. And so there's going to be real consequences for their sin. Original sin brings sin and death into the world. Original sin, by the way, isn't communicated to us like a virus through our blood, through our DNA. What we suffer are the effects of original sin, which is the deprivation or the absence of that original holiness, the possession of God's divine life. So now we're born without that. We're born with something missing. And that's why the sacraments, gifted to us by Jesus, restore that original grace, that original holiness and integrity that our first parents have. So we see Eve's curse. Her woundedness in this curse is going to be tied to her relationships, her role as mother, her relationship with Adam, with men. There's this kind of longing for intimacy. Adam's consequence, his weakness, his woundedness is going to be connected to what he does. So it describes him working. And many people, both modern psychologists and ancient commentaries, have noted the profound psychology here. That, not to make a broad brush, this isn't true in every single case, but women generally define themselves by their relationships, where men typically define themselves by their occupation, what they do. And so sadly, that means that either our relationships or our careers become the center or source of our worth, our dignity, our self-esteem, rather than the fact that our dignity, our worth, our inestimable value is found in the truth that we are sons and daughters of God, created in his image, to be his image for a broken world. So again, all that figurative language around Eve and childbirth, around Adam and working in the world, is connected to different ways that we are broken, different places we might try to find our worth, dignity, and self-esteem apart from the truth that we have the great dignity of being created in the image and likeness of God. But here's the good news. Following quickly upon this is what's called the protoevangelium, or the first good news. You see, this would be the saddest story ever if it weren't for the glorious ray of hope by which God illuminates the darkness. What he says in verse 15 of this text. And, at face value, it seems just kind of obscure language, but it's so very, very important. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. This is God speaking to the serpent. He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So God promised that the seed of the woman, a child born into the human race, would destroy the works of the devil, crush his head, including the chaos that he's made on our home. That's the first biblical prophecy of the coming Redeemer. And that's not Christian interpretation put back on Genesis 3:15. The earliest Jewish commentaries we have say this is a prediction of the Messiah, the mysterious seed of the woman. And you don't typically speak of the seed of the woman, it's the seed of the male. But here it's the seed of the woman, which is a man-child, a child born into the human race that will definitively crush the head of the serpent. If you ever saw Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, you know that that's the image in Gethsemane, another garden, when Jesus gives his definitive yes as the new Adam, undoing the knot of the first Adam's definitive no to the plans and purposes of God. You remember, you see that white serpent come out from under the tempter, and what does Jesus do? He crushes the head of the serpent. Almost every image you'll ever see of Mary, what's under Mary's foot? A crushed head of a serpent. What do we see in Revelation chapter 12? That great ancient dragon at war with the woman, clothed with glory, who gives birth to the Messiah. So we see these kind of cosmic dramas unfolding. Mary's yes, Jesus' yes, though the devil seems to strike at the heel or wound the Messiah, you could say that's the cross. Through Jesus' ultimate yes and Mary's yes to the incarnation, the head of the serpent is definitively crushed. So after his fall, Man was not abandoned by God. On the contrary, God calls him, and in a mysterious way, he heralds the coming victory over evil and issues a kind of restoration from the fall. So that's why we call this passage in Genesis the protoevangelium, the first gospel. It's the first announcement of the Messiah and the Redeemer, and of a battle between the serpent and the woman, and of the final victory of a descendant of hers, that is Jesus. So as I mentioned earlier, the Christian tradition sees in this passage an announcement of the new Adam, who, because he became obedient unto death, even death on a cross, that's Jesus, makes amends super abundantly for the disobedience of the first Adam. So that's why many fathers and doctors of the church see that the woman announced in the protoevangelium, the mysterious woman with the seed, is Mary, the mother of Christ, the new Eve. Mary benefits first of all and uniquely from Christ's victory over sin, because she was preserved from all stain of original sin and granted the special grace of God that she would commit no personal sin of any kind during her lifetime. Now, the Catechism says in paragraph 413, why didn't God prevent the first man from sinning? Why did he allow this freedom? And St. Leo the Great responds that Christ's inexpressible grace gave us blessings better than those the demon's envy had taken away. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that there's nothing to prevent human nature being raised up to something greater even after sin. God sometimes permits evil in order to draw forth some greater good. We see this even with suffering. And that's why St. Paul can say, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. In the Exultet that we sing every year, there's that wonderful line, "O happy fault, which gained for us so great a Redeemer." So even in the midst of this great fall of our first parents, God can bring good from it. God can speak a ray of hope. And what's the consequences? They leave this special place that God had given them to cultivate and keep. They've lost the presence of God. And they go out into a world that is a wasteland, that seems to be devoid of real life, into a world of suffering. And then we immediately in the next chapter see the effects on the human family. We see the consequences of this original sin immediately. Cain's gift is not accepted by God like Abel's. So what does Cain immediately conclude? He buys into that same lie. God is withholding favor or love in some kind of capricious way. Back to the Catechism again. It's so helpful in navigating these stories. Paragraph 401, in the account of Abel's murder by his brother Cain, Scripture reveals the presence of anger and envy now in the human person. Consequences of original sin. Man has become the enemy of his fellow man. And God declares this wickedness of fratricide by saying to Cain, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." So we see the proliferation of sin in the world, again, tied to that same lie. All subsequent sin, remember, comes from these same lies. God is withholding something from me. Why didn't he accept my offering? And yet he accepted the offering of my brother Abel. And it is a bit of a mystery, right? Both of those sacrifices of fruit of the earth or an animal sacrifice would be acceptable under the law that will come. But it's not what they gave, it's what they withheld. So anytime we get confused in the story, it's generally because we're not seeing the whole picture. We're not seeing Cain's heart. It wasn't the external gift, it was what was going on in his heart. God sees into the heart, Psalm 51. Only he can see our intentions. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, it seems to indicate that it wasn't a gift offered in faith. So this is the issue here. It isn't the gift. It's how we're offering the gift. It's what's going on in the human heart. Are we withholding? Are we resentful that we have to even give God a gift. So something is going on in the heart of Cain that we can't immediately see. By the way, this language that God says about the blood of Abel crying out to him, it's demu in Hebrew, verse 10 there. It literally means bloods, plural. And the rabbis say what is crying out here is all the generations of Abel throughout time that didn't come into existence because of the shedding of his blood, of the taking of that life. Think about the pro-life implications of that. When we take a human life at any stage, we're robbing the world of all the generations that would come from that soul. And this is one of the many times in the scripture that it speaks about sins that cry out to God or cry to heaven. The blood of Abel is one of those moments. The sin of the Sodomites, the cry of the people who were oppressed in Egypt. We see that in Exodus chapter 1. The cry of the foreigner, the widow, the orphan, those who are not paid a just wage. The scripture mentions all of those categories as the very sins, the great sins that cry out to heaven for him to come down and address them. And of course, Cain, like his parents, is exiled. He's sent to the east. The east always represents exile in the Bible. Now, immediately after that, we start to get a bit of Cain's lineage. And you'll see in Cain's own lineage there that violence is going to be multiplied again in his lineage. Before I go on to that, though, let me just say one last word about Abel. Have you ever heard Abel mentioned in the Mass? Because he is mentioned in the Mass. This offering of Abel, the first blood sacrifice that's offered in the world is by Abel, offered in faith. So in the first Eucharistic prayer of the Mass, which we don't hear too often, unfortunately, almost always the priest is going to choose the second Eucharistic prayer. But the first one, it says, you'll recognize this language, be pleased to look upon these offerings with a serene and kindly countenance and to accept them as once you were pleased to accept the gifts of your servant Abel the just, the sacrifice of Abraham our father in faith, and the offering of your high priest Melchizedek. So these are all figures we're going to meet in these opening chapters here. That is an ancient prayer. The Eucharistic prayer 1 in our sacramentary, before Vatican II, that was the only prayer that was prayed in the Mass. We have 4 options now, 4 Eucharistic prayers since Vatican II. And before Vatican II, that one prayer was just called the Roman Canon. And it's mentioned, this prayer, as early as the 300s. In St. Ambrose's work called The Sacraments, this prayer is discussed. So St. Ambrose is already talking about it, which means it preceded St. Ambrose. So that means for over 1,600 years, maybe closer to 1,700 years, the Church has been referring to that pleasing gift and sacrifice of God's servant, Abel the just. Now, Cain, as I mentioned, not only received the exile to go east, but he received this kind of mysterious mark of Cain. Now, in the 19th century, you're probably familiar, some slave owners and even some religious groups said that the mark of Cain was the curse of black skin. And that was a justification for holding people in slavery. Even in the LDS Church, this became the prevailing reason for not extending the Mormon priesthood to people of black skin, that they were descendants of Cain, later Ham, the son of Noah that is going to be cursed. And of course, most recently in the a series of essays the Mormon Church has released, they have disavowed that theology and apologized for the racism that had embedded itself in their own theology. Because this mark, remember, is not, the mark itself is not a curse. The mark is a mark of divine mercy and protection. It was that he was marked as protected by God, so he didn't need to fear retribution from his siblings. So remember, we only get these first two sons mentioned, but later on in the text it mentions all the other children of Adam and Eve. So they would have had many, many children likely by this point. But when you look at Cain's lineage as it unfolds in chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4, you see a proliferation of violence, culminating in his descendant called Lamech, who, just because someone offended him, is going to enact retribution 77-fold. And remember that 7 is a number of completion. In this case, it's this complete or unlimited retribution or vengeance that he's going to work into the world. So sin is going to proliferate. We'll see this in chapters 4, chapter 5, leading up to the flood in chapter 6. That sin just gets deeper and deeper in the world and embedded in the consciousness of the human person. Now, following upon the story of Cain and Abel, we see a toledot coming up now in chapter 5. Remember, toledotes means the generations. They're often markers for us in the biblical text, and oftentimes they're great genealogies or long genealogies. There's 10 of these used in Genesis. Remember, 10 is also a number of completion. 10 times God says in Genesis chapter 1, we got 10 commandments. The 10th day of the month is the Day of Atonement. So the toledotes, remember, you want to look for because they're structural markers. Each of those is a bridge from one text to another. Now, when we encounter this first great genealogy in Genesis, what's our first reaction? Well, if you're a lector, this is your first reaction, because to get a genealogy when you're a lector is one of the greatest nightmares. You have to now publicly proclaim a long list of unpronounceable names. So it scares us. And if you're just a reader or someone studying scripture, it's very tempting to skip over the genealogy. I mean, we get really weary, don't we, with this person begat this person begat this person. But remember, genealogies, toledotes, they serve as literary bridges. They're taking us from one great story to the next great story, and embedded within them are clues, themes of violence, for example, or sin that we're going to see multiplying through two lineages here. The lineage of Cain and the lineage of the righteous son that will come named Seth. And that's going to be important to understanding the upcoming verses. So you want to make sure you read the genealogies carefully. Look for themes. Look for persons that will be keys to the next narrative. See the genealogy as a narrative bridge. A couple more points to mention here also in the genealogies that often strike people when they're reading the book of Genesis is the lifespans of the figures that are mentioned. Now, there's several ways of approaching these long lives, people living 600, 700, 800 years. Number one is you can take these lifespans literally. The church doesn't forbid us from doing that, but that would mean that Adam lived only 2,000 years before Abraham. And that's the source of this new earth theory, what more modern fundamentalists have espoused, that the earth is only 6,000 years old. And we know from every stitch of archaeological evidence that the human person has been around a lot longer than 6,000 years. So that kind of strict literalism just doesn't seem to bear out when you look at acceptable science, right? Now, you could argue, I suppose, that people lived a long time because the world was new. Maybe the ozone layer was thicker, and certainly there wasn't the same kind of disease, or maybe the effects of sin and death weren't great. I've heard all of those. The second way you could think about these ages is that time was calculated differently. So these aren't maybe solar years, but it's a different kind of measurement being used here. You could look at it as each name representing a family clan. Some Bible scholars have proposed this idea. So each of the names mentioned in the genealogy is a family clan that might extend for multiple generations. But that doesn't seem to bear itself out too well because it seems to be a direct father-to-son relationship. But I would argue, at least this is my position, you can take whatever position you're most comfortable with. Remember that idea that numbers are qualitative, not quantitative? And the numeric value of people's names are significant. Do you remember when we studied Matthew? that there were those sets of generations of 14 generations in Jesus' genealogy, and 14 is the numeric value of David's name. And all of those are showing his connection to King David, for example. And then he's the end of the third set of 7. He's the new King David coming into our world. So that's how numbers are used. And I think that's likely the case here. It's largely been lost to us. I haven't studied this in great detail. But very likely the numbers associated with each of those persons signified something qualitative. Let me just give you one example of something earlier in chapter 4. Remember Lamech, that figure that's mentioned in verses 23 and 24, that area there. That little narrative about Lamech has 21 Hebrew words in it, which is 3 times 7. The Hebrew value, because every Hebrew letter has a value, of Lamech's father, Methushael, is 777, or 70 times 7. That's the language he uses in his formula for retribution. So there's a bunch of 7s embedded in the Hebrew language in that story. By the way, it's probably where Jesus gets that language later when Peter says, "How many times should I forgive?" It goes back to this language of Lamech. There's 7 members in Lamech's family mentioned. Lamech is the 7th in the line from Adam through Cain. So you see 7, 7, 7. A Hebrew person is going to see all this embedded in the text. So my thought is those long lives most likely are trying to say something more that would help us enter the story. So don't get too tied up or worried about those ages. We don't want to major in the minors. Do look at that genealogy again very closely. There's key themes mentioned there, and there's clues for what is coming next. Who are the last people mentioned in that Toledot, in that genealogy? Noah and his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They're setting us up for what's coming next. So you see that literary bridge there, that we're now entering the next part of the story. In your workbook now, as I mentioned, we'll do a few more chapters each week. You're going to be looking at chapters 6 through 11. 6 through 9 fundamentally is the flood, and then you're going to get the last major event of the primeval period, which is the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations. So we've covered the first 2 events of primeval history, the creation and the fall. Next, you're going to look at the next 2 events, which are the flood and the Table of Nations, Tower of Babel. In this email that will go out with a link to this video, I've included the suggested answers for all the lessons we'll explore for this book. So if you want to go back, if you're doing the homework, you're trying to answer those questions and you need a little bit of help, these are suggested answers. So they're not the perfect answer, but they help you get at what the question is looking for if you feel stymied or flummoxed by one of the particular questions. So it's been a real joy. We could have spent months on chapter 3 alone. There's so much there. But hopefully these tools can help us to enter more deeply into this text, what the text is trying to communicate to us about the ancient origin of sin. And if there wasn't original sin, there wouldn't be need for a redeemer. So that is very, very important to our Christian faith, that Christ, the new Adam, sets us free from our captivity to sin and death. And he restores to us what our first parents lost through disobedience. That is, his very divine life can now be put back within us again. That Setlem, that image and likeness obscured by the effects of original sin, are overcome by God's grace. And let's end, as always, with the benediction of St. Jerome. Read often, learn all that you can, and when sleep overcomes you, may the scriptures still be in your hands, and when your head falls, let it be upon the sacred page. Amen.